Thank you. Aloha and welcome back to our bicentennial speaker series. Thank you for joining in as we share our 200 years of Christianity coming to Hawaii. Today our speaker is Dr. Ronald Williams Jr., who holds a PhD in history with an emphasis in Hawaii and native Hawaiian resources. He is a former faculty member of Hawaii Nui Akea, the Hawaiian School of Knowledge at the University of Hawaii, and currently is an archivist at the Hawaii State Archives. His presentation today will focus on Keōpūolani and her influence on the early Christian missions of Hawaii. Please stay tuned all the way through the program because we will have a live question and answer series afterwards. But again, we'd like to thank all of you for tuning in with us today. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ron Williams Jr. Thank you, Ron, for joining us.
Mahalo. Mahalo. Aloha mai kākou. O wau Ron Williams Jr. He malahini wau I kia wahi o Kawaiahao I ka moko kona, I ka moko puni o Oahu. No laila e ho'omaka wau I ko'u mo'o yeah. So I'm malahini to this place. I'm a visitor to Kawaiahao. I thank them very much for inviting me. But I do want to start with my genealogy to let you know who I am. My mother is Janet Marie LaBounty. She was born in Chicago. Her family comes back from Ireland, from France, and from England. My father is Ron Williams Sr., Big Ron. My dad lives in the woods in Arkansas where he was born. He's a hunter, a fisherman, and someone who takes care of his land there in Arkansas. I was born in Chicago. I made it out to California as a teenager and came to Hawaii in 1996 from San Francisco. I was very blessed to meet my first kumu there in Lahaina, Maui, who was a Kone Akana. A Kone Akana was the leader of a group called the Friends of Moku'ula that sought to tell the 2,000-year history of Lahaina instead of the 200-year history that was quite well known. So I worked for a Kone there, ended up working luau, the Feast at Lele for a while, had a beautiful daughter who's today 22 years old. Happy birthday, Kiele. And realized at a certain point that I couldn't do luau forever. I had to get a real job. So I started going back to college. I went to Maui Community College. I took Hawaiian language classes, Hawaiian studies classes, and had a kumu there, my first academic kumu here in Hawaii, which was Keopi Raymond. Keopi Raymond taught us a little bit of language, a lot of Hawaiian knowledge, things like that. And I saw a film in class one day that really changed my life. And that was of a speaker that was the most brilliant, passionate, dedicated woman I've ever seen, and that was Dr. Haunani K. Trask. I came out to Oahu in 2003, got my BA in Hawaiian Studies under Dr. Trask, Dr. Kame'olahiva, and Dr. Osorio. Got my master's degree in Pacific Island Studies in 2008, and then got my PhD in Hawaiian History in 2013. So that's my academic and my familial mo'okuauhau, my genealogy. What I've been asked to speak about today is one of the foundational building blocks of Christianity here in Hawaii, and that is Mōʻīwahine Keōpūolani, Queen Keōpūolani. Very significant figure. It can be said that the mission would not exist were it not for Keōpūolani. There has been research done on her. There has been some published works done on her. But because of her death in 1823, which was only 3 years after the arrival of literacy in Hawaii, we don't have a lot of recorded written records of the Queen, but we do, but we do have oral histories. We have stories from people that were there at the time that have made it into larger histories, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So I have a presentation to present to you that's called He Leo Maikalani, A Voice from Heaven, Harrietta Keōpūolani and the early Christian mission in Hawaii. So let's start. So Keōpūolani, here we go. We're going to talk about three things today. We're going to talk about Kuleana to start. We're going to give you context of her life and talk about agency, talk about her action in creating the Hawaiian mission here in Hawaii. Because of her specific Kuleana, her responsibility and her privilege, her rank, she was able to do things that many others couldn't, that gave a hand to the Christian mission. So we'll first talk about Kuleana. Next, we'll talk about mission impact. What kind of impact did she have on the Christian mission here in Hawaii? And finally, we'll talk about legacy, he wahipana. Queen Keōpūolani is buried today in Lahaina, Maui, at a royal cemetery there in Lahaina, in Waine'e, Lahaina, with many other ali'i. And she continues to inspire not only Christians but non-Christians, but people from all faiths in her presence there at Waine'e Church in Lahaina. So we'll talk about that a little bit also. Okay? So what kind of sources have been used to talk about Keōpūolani to this point? I want to talk just for a few minutes about historiography. Historiography is just the process of the creation of history. It's kind of like the history of history. Here in Hawaii, that process has been dominated for over a century by English language sources. Now, why is that a problem? It's not that English language sources naturally lie and Hawaiian sources tell the truth. It's that we've got a tiny portion of the population's view on Hawaiian history. Still today, at this point, if you go into the library and you pull 100 history books on Hawaii, at least 90 of them are going to be written from just English language sources, right? Which were the missionaries, which were the missionary wives, which were the businessmen, and so forth, the visitors here to Hawaii. Now again, that's not saying they're not truthful, it's saying it's a tiny view. Hawaiians wrote prolifically about their lives, their land, and their lahui, their nation. We have over 125,000 pages of Hawaiian language newspapers published in the 19th century. It makes up about 1 million 8x11 sheets. We've got tens of thousands of Hawaiian language correspondences, letters, back and forth from the ali'i, from the maka'ainana to the ali'i, and so forth. So there's a voluminous, probably one of the largest indigenous archives in the world in Hawaiian language at the time, which was the language of the nation. So over the last 30 years, maybe a little longer, historians, native scholars have been able to start to read those sources and bring us a new history. So I want you to always remember that when we're talking about these things, to keep in context the source of the piece that we're using. Okay? Okay, so these are some of the main sources on Keōpūolani that are used today. The first one is a weekly series that was written by Samuel Kamakau that appeared in Kanu Pepo Kuakoa and told a history of Keōpūolani, Kamehameha, but also with Keōpūolani and so forth. It ran for several years and told us the birth, the presence, the activities of these people through the newspapers, through the Hawaiian language newspapers. That series has been translated into English and came out as a publication called Ruling Chiefs of Hawaii. Now again, if the English is the only thing you can access, that's the best way, that's good to go that way. But understand that you're not reading the original source, which was Makolelo Hawaii. So there are differences in translation and so forth. Okay. The second series was a series written by Stephen Deshay, who was a pastor from Hawaiʻi Island. And he wrote a book called Kamehameha and his warrior Kekuhaupio. That book also lays out the history of Kamehameha, of Keōpūolani, of their children, and so forth. So that's kind of the second main source that came from that period. Those pieces have also been translated into English and appear as a book called Kekuhaupio, Kamehameha and his warrior Kekuhaupio. Okay? There have been a couple of academic articles written about Keōpūolani. One of them by Dr. Lyons and Dr. Langlis, and another one by Esther Molokini. And they bring us much information about Keōpūolani. They've gone back to some of the primary sources and talk about her birth, her death, her life, and so forth. So we've got those two sources also. Another source is the memoirs of Keōpūolani written by Reverend William Richards. A very important source, but one that needs context. When I talked about context, it's that idea of always asking those questions of where did this come from? Now, I'm not doing that to get you to doubt any particular source at all. I'm not throwing doubt on any of these sources. What I'm saying is we have to understand as readers what they are, right? And let the reader decide, if you're a writer, if you're a historian, lay it out there and let the reader decide from themselves. The memoirs of Keōpūolani are told from the writings of Reverend Richards. So when he speaks of Keōpūolani, things she did, things she said, remember that it's not a diary, right? It's not her saying these things. It's a secondhand account. Again, not to throw dispersion on that account, but to understand where it comes from, okay? I'll give you an example really quick. I'll pick on somebody for a moment. There was a book written about 20 years ago called Shoal of Time by Gavin Dawes. He also wrote a book that talks about Honolulu history. And in that book on Honolulu history, Gavin Dawes, who's probably the most widely sold author on Hawaiian history ever, his book talks about Nahianaena, the daughter of Keōpūolani, and it says Nahiena died, and this is a quote, diseased, debauched, and guilt-ridden. Okay? Now, setting aside the personal issues there, diseased and debauched, we could argue about, but guilt-ridden comes from the fact that Reverend Richards wrote that before Nahiena died, she felt guilty that she was not a Christian, that she had fallen away from the church. Now, I'm not arguing that that didn't happen, but I'm arguing that as a historian, you cannot write she died guilt-ridden without saying Reverend Richards writes in his journal that she died guilt-ridden, right? Again, not casting doubt on the source, but just letting folks know what the source is. When we start quoting people, right, through secondhand accounts, that distorts our history. So another important part on historiography there, okay? The last source that I want to show you today is one that's a really incredible source I came across in my dissertation work about 12 years ago at the Hawaiian Mission Houses Museum and Archives, and that's the original records book of Keōpūolani's church in Lahaina, Maui, right? Well, we're going to talk a little bit later about Keōpūolani founding a church in Lahaina, the first Christian church on Maui, that the records of that church were thought to be lost in a fire in 1894. As part of my dissertation research and other work, I searched for them for years without luck. Ended up finding them one day. They were in the Hawaiian Mission House's archives, but not cataloged. And we came across those, and those were the original May 31st, 1823 records of the opening of that church of Keōpūolani and the records up until 1875. So an incredible resource from the era about her and her church. Okay, so let's move on. Oops. Kalamai. Me not knowing the tech. Here we go. Okay, get out from behind this. So Keōpūolani was born in 1778 near Wailuku, Maui, right? She had an incredibly high genealogy, a Mōʻīwahine. She was born as a ni'aupio, as an incestuous marriage, through high lineage on Maui and Hawaii Island, an ulu lineage. So she carried this mana, this power, and you can think of it as both spiritual and political, governmental. She carried this power to be a decision maker, to be someone who would make things happen, right? So she's born there on Maui, and her mother is Kekuiapo Iwanui. Her father is Kivala'o, so that very high genealogy. Her genealogy, as I mentioned, comes through that ulu line, and one of the most important people in her genealogy is a woman named Kawaiahao. Kawaiahao was the daughter of Pi'ilani, Chief Pi'ilani, of the 15th and 16th century on Maui. She was a living woman, right? When she passed at 21 years old, her iwi, her bones were taken, brought to Moku'ula, which was a sacred inland island in Lahaina, and she was deified as the mo'okua, right? The mo'o goddess, Kawaiahine. So Keōpūolani descends literally from Kawaiahao, this woman who became the famous Kawaiahine mo'o goddess. We'll talk about her in just a little bit. She was raised under that strict kapu. Esther Mo'okini says she had too many kapus to mention. When we talk about kapu, many of you probably know, but there were the kapu moi. When that ali'i came into the room, you had to lie down, moi. You couldn't be even looking at them. There's a kapu noho, a sitting kapu. All of these different kapus, kapu that if the shadow of that person fell upon you, you were put to death. All of these different kapu. And lest we think of these things as kind of eccentric oddities of religion, think of what they're doing, right? They're paying respect. They're giving mana. They're giving respect and energy and glory to that person. I taught at the university for about 10 years. If I come into my classroom and the students are not listening to me and they're throwing spit wads and they're ignoring me and so forth, how much mana do I have? If I come into the classroom and they stop and there's silence and they listen to me and they listen to my talk, then I have mana. They're giving me mana. So these rituals or these activities that might sound eccentric to us today were ways of giving mana to the ali'i. And they did that so that the ali'i could bridge that gap to the akua for them, could bring them health and life and so forth. Okay? So just a little explanation there. Pursuit by Kamehameha. Very important to understand in the history writing of Hawaii, again, for the last couple of hundred years, we've talked about the four main deity in Hawaii as the four main gods, Ku, Kane, Lono, and Kanaloa. That leaves out a very important realm of deity, and those are the Akua Wahine, the female gods, who took no backseat to anyone. Think of Pele, Kihavahine, right? These were goddesses that were worshipped by women in women's heiau, right? Who tended not to be the historians of the 19th century and so forth. So we know somewhat less about them. Nonetheless, it's my contention that Kihavahine was the important deity for Kamehameha in creating a dynasty. Kamehameha was middle to high-ranking chief. Kamakau calls him Ali'i Lepo Popolo. He can use the path of ku, the path of warfare and might, to unite the islands and become king. But his sons are going to be challenged because of his genealogy, right? There's much higher genealogies out there. So while he can become king, he won't create a legacy. He won't create a dynasty without a higher genealogy. So he takes the highest genealogy in the kingdom, and that was Keōpūolani. So at the age of about 12, she's taken by Kamehameha. She stays with her grandmother Kalola in Molokai for a while, and then joins Kamehameha again on the Big Island. But he's taking Keōpūolani for a specific reason. She's the highest ranking person in the islands, and she has that lineage to Kihavahine, the Mo'o goddess. Kihavahine is a nation-building god, right? So Kamehameha will conquer the islands through the path of ku, the path of warfare, and his family will rule the islands through the path of lono, the path of genealogy. He'll take Kihavahine and Keōpūolani into his genealogy. His sons will rule, and they did, as Kamehameha II, Kamehameha III, and so forth. Okay? So Keōpūolani served that bridge for Kamehameha. In 1789, Vancouver described a hula and mele inoa, a name chant that was performed for him, honoring Keōpūolani, right, and called her Wahine Pio, the captured woman. They were married in 1795, and she took the name Keōpūolani at that point, the gathering of the clouds in the heavens, when she marries Kamehameha in 1795. Okay? So let's look at that link to, more specifically, that link to Kihavahine. And this photograph is it's a personal photograph of mine that was given to me by the director of the museum. Kihavahine, the only image of Kihavahine available today is at the Ethnology Museum in Berlin, Germany. She was discovered in Lapahoehoe, Big Island, Hawaii Island, in the 1780s, brought back to Germany by a scientist named Dr. Arning, and she resides there in a German museum today. He was doing a worldwide exhibit on gods, and he took photographs for me. So these are from that museum. So Kala'ahiana, the daughter of Pi'ilani, yeah, and Laie Lohe Lohe Ikawai. She comes from that area of Kalua Okiha, that Moku'ula grounds in Lahaina, Ikamalu Olele, in the breadfruit shade of Lele. Okay? As I mentioned, she's an Akua Aupuni, a government god, and she's the path of Lono for Kamehameha. Okay? Dr. Klieger. So Dr. Christian Klieger produced a Mo'okauhau, a genealogy that links Keōpūolani and Kihavahine that I've listed here. So Kamehameha does conquer the islands, unites all of the islands, dies in 1819, has several wives, but his important wife, they're all important, but his wife that is important for politics is Keōpūolani. Again, she's the highest ranking person in the kingdom. She has that genealogy. Her children will become the future leaders of Hawaii. So we have Alexander Liholiho, born in 1797. We have Kauikeoli, born in 1814, and we have Nahiena, the Raging Fires, born in 1815. So these three children, post the death of Kamehameha, will be the rulers of Hawaii. Okay? So mission impact. Okay? So how does she have an effect on the Christian mission? Now, there's some very interesting research that I've come across in the last few years, through some of the work of others and some new research, that talks about the role of Keōpūolani in that first building of the mission, and brings a new kind of twist to it, and that is the role of the Tahitians that they played in that conversion also, and that building of the mission. So we'll look at that. In 1818, a Tahitian that was Christian from the London Missionary Society came to Hawaii. His name was Toketa. right? And remember, the language between the Tahitians and the Hawaiians is very similar. They can very easily communicate and so forth. And you would assume there's a level of trust between cousins that doesn't necessarily exist between strangers, right? So Toketa arrives in 1818 as a Christian missionary. We have 1819, the overthrow of the kapu, right? Kamehameha has died. Keōpūolani and Ka'ahumanu have overthrown the kapu, the religion. And we have this kind of vacuum of religion in Hawaii, at least as a state religion, right? People are still practicing at home and so forth. In 1820, we have the arrival of the American Protestant Mission from Boston to Hawaii. The American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions send those first missionaries to Hawaii in 1820. In 1823, we have Tau'a, another Tahitian, that arrives and importantly becomes kahu for Keōpūolani. Again, she, intelligent woman, her and Ka'ahumanu both are assessing this new religion. They're giving it a trial run. They're checking it out. We've seen that those men have mana, right? They eat with their women and the women, and nobody dies. They have these big ships. They have this new technology of literacy, of writing, right? So there's mana there. So they're kind of checking it out and testing it out. And Tau'a and Toketa are there to tell them, we've experienced this, right? And we believe in this also. Okay? In May of 1823, Keōpūolani returns to the home of her birth. So she was living in Oahu, Honolulu in Oahu with Kamehameha. He passes. She stays there with the chiefs and so forth. And she becomes a little bit kind of, I don't want to imply anything that's not evidence, but she obviously wants to come home, right? To her home. She was born in Wailuku, Maui. So she decides to come to Maui and bring with her this mission that has started in Honolulu and other places. And so she asks Tau'a, the Tahitian missionary, to come with her, and she takes two others of that mission who have just arrived months earlier, right? The second company of missions in 1823, and that was Reverend Richards, yeah, and Reverend Stewart. And so Reverend Richards, Reverend Stewart, their wives, Kau'a, and Betsy Stockton, African American woman from the United States, who had been with the missionaries. She comes also, right? And they go to Lahaina, Maui, back home for Keōpūolani. They arrive in May 31st, 1823. They have a mass or a service on the beach there at Lele in Lahaina. Hundreds come. Now remember, she has that kuleana, right? She has that mana. So when she goes to church, everyone goes to church, right? So you have literally hundreds and hundreds of people gathering on the beach there today. If you know Lahaina, it's near where the post office is, near the beach. And they gather there for the first Christian service on Maui on May 31st, 1823, right? They'll take that and move across the street and build a mission station where you see Reverend Baldwin's house today, right? And they'll build a thatched church there that will eventually move to the site where the church is today in Lahaina. So we talked about Toketa, we talked about the Tahitians and Hawaiian connection. This journal is in the Hawaii State Archives. I discovered it about a year and a half ago, and it is recorded to be the first journal ever written in Hawaiian language. The first journal ever written in Hawaiian language. It starts in 1819. So this is pre the arrival of the missionaries. So how could they write? Because it wasn't a Hawaiian. It was the Tahitian, Toketa, who had been Christianized, who learned literacy in Tahiti, came to Hawaii and started recording what he was doing and when the missionaries arrived and so forth. So this Tahitian was the first written Hawaiian journal, and you'll see it there. The title of it is Historical Accounts, Contemporary Life, and Some Kahunapule, some medicine in the Sandwich Islands, written by Toketa of Bora Bora and Kahikona of Norway. Now that's a mistake. Kahikona wasn't from Norway. He was from a small island near Tahiti that they couldn't pronounce, and they took it out. They made it out as Norway, the people who wrote the title. But these were two Tahitians. 1815, the London Missionary Society had arrived in Tahiti. 1818, Toketa had traveled to Hawaii with Reverend Ellis, the London Missionary Society Reverend. He's placed in the household of Governor Kuakini, learned Hawaiian language, and began his journal. So again, why is this connected? Why is this important? Because you have a literate Tahitian, right, before the missionaries arrived, who now is going to, when the missionaries arrive, is going to become part of Kalamai, part of their company, part of their effort, and give Keōpūolani and Kahumanu someone else to trust in this mission of looking for this new word. Okay? In 1822, he accompanied Kahumanu and Kaumoali'i on a trip around Hawaiʻi Island and writes letter of 8 February for Kuakini to Reverend Hiram Bingham. So he becomes, at this point again, that link, that bridge between the American mission and the Ali'i. This book, as I mentioned earlier, is an incredibly important book. Now, I'll mention how it was found. It was the first church records book in Lahaina. As I mentioned, it was presumed lost in the 1894 fire that burned the entire church. I was going through some newspapers in 1917, and they mentioned in a small blurb that Dr. Lydecker was the first archivist in Hawaii for the territorial archives, but Dr. Lydecker had discovered this church history book, is what it said, in the courthouse in Lahaina. So the book had made it to the courthouse, which is only blocks away, and then had been turned over and so forth and so forth. So that got the trail started, eventually discovered it at the Hawaiian Mission houses. But let's look at this. Records of the church at Lahaina, Maui from its commencement. Okay? That's the front page, right? May 31st. So on the 31st of May, 1823, the following members of the Sandwich Islands Church took up their residence in Lahaina, where, by administering the ordinances, communing together, exercising discipline, etc., they to a certain extent constituted a separate church. Right? Those first 7 members of Keōpūolani's church were Charles Stewart, his wife Harriet, William Richards, his wife Clarissa, Betsy Stockton, the African American, William Kamohula, and Kau'a, right, the Tahitian. So those were the first 7 members of an American Protestant Christian church on Maui. Right? Now, Keōpūolani obviously couldn't become a member because she wasn't baptized yet. But she's founding this church, May 31st, 1823, for the American mission. And those are the first members. Ecclesia o Keōpūolani. Let's talk about terms for a minute. Ecclesia is the congregation, is the instituted church. Ecclesia o Kawaiahao, right? It's the congregation, the institution. Halepule is the building, right? So when we talk about Ecclesia o Keōpūolani, we're talking about that church that she formed as an entity. Okay? 19th of October, 1823, at that church, Ulumahehe Ho'opili and Kalakua Kahehe Malie married at Kahalepule o Waine'e as the first Christian marriage among Ali'i. So in 1823, at Keōpūolani's church, we have the first Christian marriage of Ali'i in Hawaii. January 12th, 1825, the infant daughter of Tau'a baptized. So now we start to have more baptisms, more members becoming part of that church. 18th of April, Pua'aiki and Tau'a baptized. Pua'aiki, blind Bartimaeus, very famous, one of the first licensed pastors in Hawaii, native licensed pastors. He's baptized into Keōpūolani's church, as is Tau'a's wife. January 14th, 1827, Mōʻīwahine Nahiena Ena is baptized. Very important note. So the daughter of Keōpūolani, right, who she's left entrusted to Reverend Richards, is baptized there at the church that Keōpūolani founded. 14th of September, 1828, the cornerstone is laid for Ecclesia o Ebenezera. Now that first church that was founded there in Lahaina was just called the church in Lahaina, the church at Waine'e, which was one of the Ahupua'a, right? Its borders Waine'e and Waiokama. But so it was called the church at Lahaina or the church at Waine'e. It moved across the street to that thatched hut. It was still called that. It moved over to where the present day church is today, on next to Prison Street, on Luakini Street and Shaw, right? And where that church is today is where this stone church was built. Not the first, but by far the grandest, most elaborate stone church yet built in the islands. And it was built by order of Ho'opili. Right? Ho'opili was very close to Kahumanu and Keōpūolani. He was the governor of Maui. He was close to Kamehameha in his life. And he says, we're going to have a Christian church here in Lahaina, and it's going to be built here. And he named it Ebenezera, Ebenezer, the rock of Ebenezer in the Bible, right? So that church becomes Ecclesia o Ebenezera in 1828 is when that cornerstone laid, and it is built this huge church that seats 3,000 people. And because it was the church of Keōpūolani, now she has passed at this point. I'll go back to that in a minute. But so she has passed, but that legacy, that idea that she has accepted this, right? She was baptized hours before her death, means that the people of Lahaina, the people of Moku'ula, the people of that the people of that Mokupuni are pushed to come to Lahaina Church, and they do. And many are baptized and become part of that church. It was said in several instances of the Hawaiian Islands newspapers that there were 3,000 attendees at the church twice on Sundays. So this is the church that she founded. So up until about 5 years ago, we had no no photographs of the church. Up until about 1890s was when the first photograph that we had was. Another discovery as part of my dissertation was at the Hawaiian mission houses of a daguerreotype photo, circa 1853, of the church. And my former kumu, Koni Akana, I wished he was alive to see it. We all had imagined what the church looked like in 1850, but not only that, bordering the church on the Makai side was Moku'ula. It was the sacred island of the rule of Lani, Kauikeaoli, and so forth, where Keōpūolani and Nahiena and others were buried. So we had a photograph of Moku'ula, of that inland freshwater fish pond. And I'll show it to you here. This is a daguerreotype photo from 1853 of Ebenezer Church, Keōpūolani's church, and in the foreground you see the fish pond of Moku'ula. Yeah, a really stunning photograph. But that is the church of Keōpūolani, started as the first church on Maui. Now where that church sits today sits Waiolae Church. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Here's the daguerreotype, circa 1853. Once again, it's at the Hawaiian mission houses. Okay. Now, I mentioned the death of Keōpūolani in 1823. She was baptized by Reverend Richards hours before her death, became part, at that point, of the church. After her death, there was a funeral. She was brought to Halipiola, which is across the street, on the Makai side of Front Street today. And then she was moved and buried at Moku'ula, which was, again, that sacred residence of 600 years of rule central rule in Maui, and part of and the first capital of the Hawaiian Kingdom. So she's buried there at Moku'ula. When I approached the church 20 years ago to meet them and talk with them and start to work on my dissertation, I was told that she had been moved from Moku'ula to the Christian church. It's about 200 yards away, and was buried today at the church, right? Since that discussion, we have found evidence. There are several oral histories and some written histories, as you'll see here, of her being buried at Waine'e. So, and I forget the year, Kalamai, I think it was 1883 or 2. Princess Pauahi, just prior to her unfortunate death, asked that the ali'i burials be better taken care of and found out and gathered and so forth. And as part of that effort, they went around and found out where these folks were. This is a letter from the chiefess Kalola, and it talks about ka hōʻike a Kalola no ka iwi o nā ali'i, it should be Vaiho, Kalamai, I Vaihola ma Waine'e Lahaina Maui. So the ali'i bones that are placed at Waine'e Maui. And she lists there under paragraph 3, o Keōpūolani o Nahiena ana Ameleliha, right? There's a former historian cultural historian of Lahaina, what's her name? Agnes, I forget her last name, Kalamai. I'll think of it in a second. But she talked about this burial, and she had an oral history witness, a kupuna who was there, who talked about that at about 12 midnight, they started to do the unearthing of the burials and move them to the church. And there was great difficulty. Pule were said, ceremonies were performed, and eventually those bodies were moved from Moku'ula up to Waine'e Church. Now there are still burials at Moku'ula. Dr. Christian Klieger and others have done excavations there to rebuild the site, and they've found out that there still are burials there. But we do know that Nahiena Ana, Keōpūolani, and so forth were moved up to the Christian church. Okay? Here's a map. This is actually from Bernice Pauahi Bishop Museum that shows the church, right? This is circa 1887. So the church there, the burial grounds, and the black part you see is the place where Keōpūolani and Nahiena Ana and many of the other ali'i were buried. So lastly, legacy. So we have this understanding of, first of all, her mana, right? Her kuleana, her ability to make decisions, her ability to affect her people and society in general. And we move that into this project that is the American Protestant Christian Mission, right? And so we have that established. We have this church established that is standing today, right? And so we talk about now her legacy. She's been, buried for almost 200 years. How does this Hawaiian wahine, this Mōʻīwahine, this queen, affect people today? These photographs come from the 1940s and 50s. The degradation at that grave site, right? Overgrown trees, the concrete is starting to fall away. There are almost a dozen of the highest ali'i in Hawaii buried there with Keōpūolani. Okay, Kaumoali'i, as you can imagine, the Kauai chief, is buried next to her. Heriata Keōpūolani Nahiena Ena, Lumahehe Ho'opili, Kalakua Kehehe Malie, who was Ho'opili's wife. She's sometimes called Ho'opili Wahine. She also is the grandmother of Kamehameha IV and Kamehameha V. So she's buried there also. Kaumoali'i, the Kauai chief, Miriam Kekaunohi, and Liliha are all there in that royal cemetery. There's another photograph of kind of the overgrown degradation that's happening there at the church in the 1950s and 60s. And then a group called the Friends of Keōpūolani was founded in 1984 by descendants of Keōpūolani. I've met several of them, wonderful people. They started a group to honor Keōpūolani and bring back that vision that she had and bring back that glory. We talk about the Royal Cemetery in Nu'uanu and how much it's honored and thought about and so forth. Well, we have burials of equal value, of equal historic value, of equal inspiration there at Lahaina. So they started this project of kind of seeing what could be done. Years went by, some very important work was done, but it never really took off. And then along came a wonderful gentleman named Keith Kamalani Onako'ulau Kaleleiki. Yeah? I call him Tama. Tama is a wonderful man who took on that kuleana in 2011. Now, he had done it for a long time. For about 30 years, Tama had taken the kuleana of taking care of the burials of the church. So he'd go out on Saturdays. He was a member of the Waiōla Church today. He would go out on Saturdays and water the lawns, rake, pick up, talk to kupuna who came by about the burials there, hundreds of unmarked burials that he took accounts of, started creating, records of and so forth. And then founded in 2011 a group called Nā Kia'io Waine'e, the Guardians of Waine'e. And that group took it upon themselves to really make this their kuleana. And they did. They brought back the instruction of Keōpūolani. They brought back the tomb itself. They had it repaired and fixed up. They started doing tours for schools so that 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th graders in Hawaii can come understand the importance of Keōpūolani and her link to the mission and so forth. That group today this is a recent photograph of the tomb, the royal tomb there, right? Another one there. And so it was this February. This February, prior to COVID, they had a 196-year anniversary, I think 6-year anniversary, my math's not too great, of Keōpūolani's founding of the church. And it was an event that was sponsored also by the County of Maui. Ellie Cochran, who was one of the county councilwomen a couple of years ago, set aside the money, the funds for this. So the County of Maui, the people of Maui, and Waiōla Church honored Keōpūolani and her resting site there this last February. Here's a photograph of some of the Nā Kia'io Waine'e members. And finally, this is the event that happened. 196 years at Waiōla. The County of Maui, Waiōla Church, and Nā Kia'io Waine'e celebrate 196 years of the presence, spirit, and aloha of Mōʻīwahine Keōpūolani at Waiōla Church. Now, to give you the story of the name really quickly, Waine'e Church, Ebenezer, the name was kind of, we don't know why, but kind of not used anymore and lost. And so they started calling it Waine'e Church, back to Waine'e Church. It was incorporated as Ka'aklesia o Waine'e. Yeah? But in the 1950s, the church had burned down twice and had blown down 4 times. Now, one final story I have to tell you about the historiography. So, because it tells you a little bit about Kalamai, but the ho'okano, the way some of the early folks, visitors to Hawaii, thought of this as their religion, and Hawaiians thought otherwise. When the mission first arrived in Lahaina, and they were building the first Waine'e church, they built the church, and they started to build it, and Kupuna would come out and tell them, oh, you need it, and no, we got this, we're from Boston, we got this, we're modern technology people, we got this, and they built the church, and it blew down 2 weeks later. And they built it again, and the people were saying, well, no, come on, we got this, and they built the church, and it blew down again. After the third time in 2 years of the church blowing down, they went back to the kupuna and said, I'm sorry, what were you saying about that thing? And the kupuna told them, the kaua'ula winds. They come right down through the valley every year, and they come right back through here. You got to build the church over here, and you have to turn it into the wind and so forth. And I love that story because it talks about that knowledge of the land, right? That knowledge of your place, of your home that Hawaiians carried. So we always have to remember that when we think about this idea of a Christianity that wasn't theirs. It was theirs, and they understood it, and they understood it sometimes better than their teachers. Okay, so back to 196. 196th anniversary was just this year. As we come up on the 200th anniversary of the founding of a church in Maui by Keōpūolani, I would ask that everyone start to think about these stories. The length, the breadth, the incorporation of these stories and how they inspire people today, right? I did a project, I found a grant and did a project with the church about 5 years ago that created primary resourced Hawaiian language-based curriculum around the burials there at Waine'e Church. I've listed a link in the talk to that place where you can go and pull that down absolutely free if you're interested in having that curriculum. But I can tell you this has been used now by Kamehameha Schools Maui, by several schools that visit, and to see the kids, to see the third graders, fourth graders, fifth graders, start to not only have this understanding of the Christian mission in Hawaii, but be able to link it to a li'i like Keōpūolani, right? This mother of a nation who brought this and instituted this for them. And here they are 200 years later, receiving that gift once again, and able to pay homage to her and respect to her back. Thank you.
That's it? I could have you go on for another hour. Perhaps we'll have you back. So I wanted to say thank you, everyone, for joining us on our virtual presentation. Again, stay tuned. If you have any questions, just write them into the chat, and then we'll relay them on to Ron. So again, thank you very much. Just remember, the third Sunday at 4 o'clock Hawaii time, we will be presenting another set of our speaker series every month. So again, we'd like to thank you. You can tune into our Kawaiahao Church YouTube if you'd like to listen to our Sunday services, as well as access some of the other presentations that we've had. So mahalo nui to Ron. We're looking forward to having you back. Excuse me, Dr. Williams. Mahalo, and now we will cut over to the chat. Thank you again for joining us. Mahalo and aloha. Please put it you'll need to type it into the chat of YouTube. And sorry, I'm just typing that in for Dr. Williams. Okay, so, to get us started, Dr. Williams, you mentioned that Reverend Richard was the first kahu of the Lahaina Church. Did he also serve in the government? You know, that's always been a controversy, as those who have served and those who haven't. So I'm just wondering, you mentioned about Reverend Richard of Lahaina Church.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. It really gets to a larger narrative about the mission.
the master narrative, the general narrative that we hear about missionaries is they arrived in 1820 and there was this teleologic or natural progression to them overthrowing the kingdom, right? But what we don't understand, what happens when we don't look into the more specifics of the mission is that, of course, no one alive in 1820 was still around in 1893, but also it was a much, much different mission that was morphed mid-century. So the first missionaries arrived in 1820 with specific instructions that they weren't allowed to earn money, they weren't allowed to become involved in politics, and so forth. And they stuck to those things almost to a T. And so that first mission of early missionaries was here to bring the gospel of Christ. Whether you see that as good or bad, that was their mission. So in 1863, the mission in Boston, the ABCFM in Boston declares mission success. They say, you've created a Christian nation, great job, now come home. The sons and grandsons of the mission who were here in Hawaii in the 1860s and who had, come into business or done different things, many of them, not all of them, many of them didn't want to give up their position in society, in the church, and so forth. And so they created this new idea of what the mission was, and that involved economics and politics and so forth, which was vastly different from their fathers. Their fathers' mission, again, was strictly about religion. And we know this because of folks like Reverend Richards. Reverend Richards was Keōpūolani's pastor. I mean, he was central to the idea of Christianity being brought to Hawaii and flourishing in Hawaii. Yet, when Kauikeʻoli, Kamehameha III, needs someone to help him build a constitutional monarchy, he turns to Reverend Richards, because there's no Hawaiians here who have taken constitutional law and so forth. Reverend Richards had read up on legal notes and also was receiving legal books and judicial books and so forth from back east. And so he actually quit the mission. He resigned as a missionary to take that position as an advisor to Kauikeʻoli. And there's one other part, I know this answer is running long, but there's one other part that I need to say, and that is our idea of that creation of a constitutional monarchy has shifted dramatically. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we had always saw that as an imposition of the missionaries and the Americans and so forth. What we've come to understand through Hawaiian language resources and a lot of other things is that in the 1830s and 40s, Hawaii was going to be the next country taken. The Europeans were taking countries throughout the Pacific, grabbing them and claiming them. Hawaii was next. It was strategically located right in the middle between the west coast of the United States and Asia. And so there's no question it would have been taken. It didn't have a standing army. It's going to be gone. The only chance that Kauikeʻoli has to preserve his nation's independence is to create a type of government that the rest of the world will recognize and respect. And so he shifts brilliantly. He shifts from this absolute monarch. And I don't know another instance. One of my areas in my PhD is world history. I don't know of another instance when an absolute ruler had control of everything, voluntarily gave up much of his power for this reason. Usually there's a revolution. Usually there's pressure. But Kauikeʻoli said, I'm going to give up 2/3 of my power by creating a constitutional monarchy. It will have an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. And I'm going to do that to create a government that hopefully will be recognized and will be kept independent. And that happened. In 1843, that constitutional monarchy, created in large part by William Richards and others, was recognized by England and France as an independent nation, and that saved Hawaiian independence for another 50 years. Now, it'll be 1893, there'll be a breaking of that international law that that robs Hawaii of its independence. But in 1843, it was established because of Kauikeʻoli, and one of his main advisors was William Richards.
Okay, I think Malia next had a question, which ties into Chris Cook's question that's on our YouTube. So go ahead, Malia. I'll let you tie in that whole question.
Aloha, Ron. Thank you so much. This is so fascinating. I've always wanted to learn more about Keōpūolani as a keikio ka'aina from Lahaina. You know, she has always been an ali'i that fascinated me, and yet I never quite knew enough. So thank you so much for what you have shared today. And so Chris Cook and I both have been thinking about, you were speaking about some of the highest Hawaiian ali'i that are buried with Keōpūolani and Nahianana there in Lahaina at the Waine'e Church, which includes Chief Kaumoali'i. And we know him to be Kauai's High Chief. And we know that his son, Humehume, comes back to Hawaii with the first company of missionaries, and then is sent to Kauai with the first group that establishes the mission there on Kauai in Waimea. And so we're wondering, first of all, why is it that Kaumoali'i ends up being buried in Lahaina and not being buried on Kauai? And also, was Kaumoali'i a converted Christian? Did he also convert? Like, did his son have any role in that? Did Keōpūolani have any? Like, can you expound a little bit more? Do you know about Kaumoali'i and his relationship to Keōpūolani and the Christian mission and what have you?
Right. So great question. I do know some, but not everything to answer your question entirely. Kaumoali'i was, the reason he was buried at the foot of Keōpūolani we have record of, and that is his writings talking about the fact that that's what he wanted. He was very pili to Keōpūolani. After the death of Kamehameha, he was the one that basically was to help be with her and support her and so forth. And so he had written quite earlier that when she dies, I'll be buried at her foot. So there are records of that. As far as him being a Christian, I don't believe there are any written records of that. His baptism would have been a significant affair. So I think that would have been recorded. So I don't know that he was baptized. I do know that Keōpūolani was, to put it nicely, had a powerful effect on all of those around her. And there's no question that she had sincerely accepted this new path. And so she puts her children, Nahianana, Kawikioli, and Liho, under the malu, the protection of Reverend Richards. And certainly Kaumoali'i would have been affected, right, by her new beliefs. But I don't know personally, and I don't know if there's any writings specifically about whether he accepted Christianity or not.
Well, Malia, does that answer your question? And Chris Cook, if you're listening, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much.
Okay. Keiko, did you want to have a question there? Or?
Yes, Dr. Juan. Hi.
Yes. Aloha.
Yes. So Keōpūolani and other ali'i, it fascinates me that the rapid acceptance of these missionaries coming and their desire to learn more about the one God, and then to actually want to accept the practices. For example, I read that Keōpūolani, knowing that Christianity only allows monogamy, and so she chooses the route to accept only one, which is hoʻopili. And so I just wondered, and then of course she wants to be baptized too, right? And so I just wondered, from the standpoint of them being under so many, hundreds of years of the kapu system to actually just go through that transition so quickly. What do you think about that?
Right, a great question. So we have to see it in context of how they likely saw, we don't have a lot of writings, but how they likely saw this new religion, right? Polynesians were polytheistic for like, as you said, for thousands of years. And this is kind of a difficult balance to walk, because there are certainly evidences of a sincere acceptance of this new religion. But it's also not fair to think that they had these general understandings of how the universe worked and they switched them in 2 years, right? What likely happened, and what a lot of analysis shows us that happened, is that they incorporated this new mana, right, into their understanding originally. So when you're talking about a Christian, when you're talking about a Christian who went to church at Waine'e Church in 1824, because Keōpūolani had been there, the average Hawaiian who's coming from kahunapule and going to church there, they may or may not have known and completely accepted all of the teachings of Christianity. But they certainly understood that this new entity had mana, right? Had spiritual force. As I mentioned, this institution showed its worth to those first elite. And we have to understand the acceptance by Keōpūolani and by Ka'ahumanu as a complicated thing. Again, I'm not trying to imply that they weren't sincere in their belief of Christianity and what they knew about it at the time, but it was also very much a political move by Keōpūolani and especially Ka'ahumanu. When Kamehameha dies in 1819, traditionally, for thousands of years, there's been basically a huli and a kind of reorganization of the government and a redivision of lands and so forth, and a little bit of a power struggle for a bit, right? And Keōpūolani is pretty much set because she's got the highest lineage out there, and she's got these children of Kamehameha who are set to be the next ali'i, the next mo'i, the next rulers. But Ka'ahumanu, for all her peeliness to Kamehameha, is kind of out there. Like, what's going to happen to her? Where is she going to fit into this new court? Yeah. And so she steps forward and says, on his deathbed, Kamehameha made me kuhina nui, this brand new position of co-regent, right? And so she is saying he created this position that puts her at the central point of government along with Keōpūolani's children, right? And the power at that point, 1820, 1821, 1822, the mana is with these new folks who have arrived. Again, they've got technology, they've got ships. You can't underestimate the power of literacy, of what that was. The idea that you could be on a beach and a general or somebody could write something down on paper and send it down the beach, and somebody down there could understand what you're talking about without even saying anything. That idea of literacy was powerful. And the Christian missionary is the one who had literacy and brought literacy. When we talk about education in Hawaii, the schools were Christian schools. And so if you wanted that education, you became Christian. Again, I'm not casting dispersion on the idea that Hawaiians accepted Christianity, but I'm saying it was complex. And that there was a lot of power in there. There was a lot of governmental politics in there. And there was a lot of, as I mentioned, I think from our view, from our Western view, and certainly from my view, I was raised Catholic and I was Christian, different denominations of Christian for a while. And from my view, I always saw of it as this black and white thing. How can you believe this when that's different than that other Christianity that you were 5 years ago? To Hawaiians, it was about mana. It was about power. And so wherever you found that power, right, was that relationship you needed to have health, to have a good crop, and so forth. And so it wasn't this thing where we go through Christianity and pick out things and say, well, wait a minute, Hawaiians wouldn't have believed that. No, they wouldn't have, and they didn't. but they came to understand. I'll give you a quick, sorry I'm running these answers so long, but they are complicated. I'll give you a good example. When the first laws are written in Hawaii, the first written laws ever in Hawaii, 1827, I believe, and there's a publication that Ka'ahumanu puts out. That's the first criminal code in Hawaii. And we've always known it as these 5 first laws. And they are no murder, no theft, no drinking rum, no gambling, and no ho'okamakama, which is prostitution, right? So those are the first 5 laws in Hawaii. No murder, theft, gambling, drinking rum, and prostitution. So they get printed out. And I knew those, and they printed. I was researching this at the State Archives a couple of years ago, and I came across a few of the original printings. And the first one that went out actually was 6 laws. There's 6, not 5. And so what had happened is they had come up with 6 in council of the chiefs, and then had decided at the last minute, even after printing, that they're going to cut back down to 5. So what was that law that was lost? Any guesses? It was moi kolohe. It was adultery. And it was this idea of sleeping with more than one person. And you have to understand that at this council, someone, probably a British advisor or missionary, somebody said, well, adultery should be one of them. And the chiefs agreed. And then somebody said, well, wait a minute. Like, that's not going to fly. And I don't mean that in a moral judgment way. I mean that in a cultural way. That's not what they had done for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So again, these Christians in 1820 had accepted the fact that this new mana was here, what this new power was here. What I will say is by the 1850s and 60s, they became the Christians that we know of as New England Christianers in a way. And by the 1870s and 1880s had come to know the Bible, the Christian Bible, and know their relationship with God. And I say this as a non-Christian. I'm not promoting Christianity. But they had come to know Christianity and understand Christianity and have a relationship with that God that often surpassed that of the missionary sons and grandsons. The people who there's a gentleman named William Abraham Kiha, who was a interpreter of the Bible in the 1880s and 90s, who was native Hawaiian, who wrote in Hawaiian and English. He writes a brilliant preface to a book on Revelations. And he says straight out, he says, mahalo to Binamu guys. Thank you to Brigham and those guys for bringing us the gospel. But their sons and grandsons have become apostates. Those sons and grandsons of the mission who had chosen to impose the 1887 Bayonet Constitution, who had chosen to follow the greed and the need for power to overthrow the queen and so forth, their Hawaiians are confidently saying in the 1880s and 90s, we know Christianity, and these folks aren't being Christian. So there was a path that Hawaiians followed to a understanding of that religion that became dead sincere. Today you go to I had the pleasure of going to church on Kauai with at the Niihau Church, and that's a group of Christian folk, and no one would pause. No one would in a million years say that they're not Hawaiian, right? There's this understanding of Christianity that Hawaiians claimed and owned by the 1870s and 80s and so forth. Again, a long answer, sorry, but that's what I would say.
I like the long answers, Ron. That's good. Now we have two questions coming from our YouTube chat. The first one is from Keone Bunag, and he says, aloha, Ron. Would you be able to speak or share a bit about Keōpūolani and Nahi'ena'ena? How did the conversion of their mother and her influence on the people affect their own lives as ali'i?
Great question. Okay. Such rich questions, and I'm sorry, but this is going to take a little bit too. but it's critical to our understanding of this period, and our taking blinders off about our side. Right there's often a missionary side and an anti-missionary side, and we've got to understand that things were much, much more complex than that. They always are. There's no question that Keōpūolani set her children to be under the mission and Reverend Richards, I'm sorry. But it became very complicated. So Nahi'ena'ena, most people know that story of how she was torn between the mission and so forth. A couple of details that I think are less widely known but are critical are that so Keōpūolani dies in 1823. Around that time, 23, 24, the number one question on everybody's mind in the kingdom wasn't necessarily Christianity. It was death from disease. I mean, we reached that point, a 70, 80% loss of life from the arrival of Cook. So I used to tell my students, imagine in a class of 40 folks, if you came back to class next week and 12 of them had died. And then we came next week and 4 more had died. And next week and 6 more had died. And by the end of the semester, we're left with 7 or 8 students. I mean, it was that bad. And to Native Hawaiians, that was an obvious ho'ailona that there was pilikia, there was problem. There was something God or the gods weren't happy with. And so for many traditional Hawaiians, and there were chiefs that were still looking at that traditional path to answering this problem, The answer was to create an akua, a new god, and we have to be careful about using that term God, right? To create someone with much power who can address this problem. And so traditionally that would have been a mi'aupio mating, an incestuous mating of the highest lineages. So that's Kawikioli. I'm sorry, at that time, that's Liholiho and Nahiane'ena. And so there's this push to have Liholiho and Nahiane'ena join to create a person that will be able to address this problem. Now, of course, the missionaries are pushing against that, and of course, many folks are pushing against that. But it's a real contestation. And Liholiho dies in his trip to London abroad, and so now that kuleana has fallen to Kawikioli, and so Kawikioli is wearing that kuleana. So in 1823 in Lahaina, a mission starts among some ali'i and many maka'ainana to follow this path. And so they start to create a pa'u, a feather pa'u, a skirt for Nahiane'ena. Now understand, it was kapu for women to wear feathers in general. There were some exceptions, but in general, women didn't wear the ahu, the aha, and so forth. But this question needs an extraordinary answer, and so they start to create a feather pa'u, not a cape, but a pa'u, a skirt for Nahiane'ena. Now it's my contention, and Dr. Charlot's and others by now, that the use of a pa'u was purposeful. They were glorifying her ma'i, her genitalia, her ability to procreate a new person or thing or somebody who could solve this problem. So you have the two highest ranking people in the kingdom uniting to form this new person, and the whole event is going to be consecrated by this sacred pa'u. We know it's a national project because it has 1 million o'o feathers, 1 million yellow feathers. The o'o bird, the black and yellow bird, had between 8 and 12 yellow feathers on each bird. So, I mean, my math's not that great, but how many birds is that to make 1 million? I mean, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of birds. And so it wasn't a Lahaina project. It was a national project to create this pa'u to save the kingdom from death, from disease. So in the midst of, yes, an acceptance of Christianity, we also had this traditional push for this other thing. And so Nahiane'ena is stuck there in the middle. The pa'u is created. It's 20 feet long by 2.5 feet wide. It's the most remarkable artifact I've ever seen. It's the largest piece of featherwork in the world. 20 feet by 2.5 feet. She does wear it on 2 occasions, and she is pushed to follow this path. So you have Kawikioli in Honolulu, who's accepted this. His acceptance of the mission was very fraught, and so he says, yes, we're going to do this. Nahiane'ena is with Reverend Richards. She'll go visit her brother, and she'll change her mind. She'll come back. And so that record book of the Lahaina Church literally narrates what the mission would say is her fall. She's called out one Sunday at church. And this is another point where we have to talk about the impact and the power of the mission. Now understand, 10 years earlier, Nahiane'ena was considered a living, walking deity. She was sacred. And now, on this Sunday in church, she comes to church, and Reverend Richards calls her out in front of everybody and says, you were drinking rum last Saturday and hanging out with your brother. You need to get out, you need to leave, you need to step outside church. Now, who's he to tell her that, right? That's God. But that's what's happening. So we start to understand maybe not understand, but we start to see the power of this new church, of this new religion. And so Nahiane'ena does, she repents, she goes back, she's suspended, she goes back, and so forth. Eventually, in 1836, so she's married to a Hawaiian prince, right? But in 1830, and a very interesting event happens. And this is the wonderful part about the history that makes it so complex, because we know it happened, is that she's visiting with her brother in Honolulu. He sends out a crier. We have a ship captain's journal, and we have 2 other accounts of a crier that was sent out throughout Honolulu, a person to announce events, to say and tell the people of Honolulu, Kauikeoli and Nahianen are over there procreating. And as absurd as that sounds, it was Kauikeoli's saying, when she becomes hapai, I want it known this is my child. And so he sends a crier throughout town talking about this union. She becomes hapai. She comes back. Now, prior to her becoming hapai, she comes back to Lahaina. She's actually excommunicated from the Lahaina church. She meets with Reverend Richards. I believe we don't have her words, but I believe she was sincerely reticent. And so she apologizes. She begs for forgiveness. She messes up again, and then they excommunicate her from the church. So she leaves that church at that point in 1836. She goes back to her brother. She gives birth on September 17th, 1836. The child of Kauikeoli and Nahianen dies a few hours after birth. He would have been the heir apparent to the throne and the traditional answer to this problem of death from disease. Kauikeoli is heartbroken. Nahianen is also. She dies from complications of that birth 3 months later on December 30th, 1836. Kauikeoli takes her body back to his Haleoluhe, his fern palace over where near Queen's Hospital is now, and he keeps her there with him. He refuses to part with her. The newspapers all ask, when's he going to bury her? When's he going to bury her? And he refuses. She dies December 30th. February 4th, he agrees to have a funeral for her at Kawaiahao. Now, there's not the stone church yet, but there's that space. And so he has a funeral for her at Kawaiahao Church. We have Hawaiian language and English language accounts of it. But following the funeral, he takes her back to Haleoluhe. Keeps her there until April. In April, he purchases a ship called the Don Quixote, a Spanish ship, renames it the Kai Harrieta Keōpūolani, flies the Hawaiian ensign, the Hawaii Kalaunu, for the first time over that ship, and sails to Lahaina, Maui, where he buries Nahianen with her mother Keōpūolani at Moku'ula. There's an incredible story of them landing at Mala, and they cut out a path from Malu'ulu Lele in the breadfruit shade of Lele. They cut out a path down the street to Moku'ula, and they have a formal funeral to bury her at Moku'ula. Later, she's moved to the Christian Church of Waiʻi. Yeah. So, in summary, it's that relationship of Nahianen, her children, and the mission, and the traditional answers to these problems played out in that period, and they showed us how deep the struggle was, and it wasn't necessarily a black and white antagonistic struggle. It was a relatively quick move from one base of power to another. And again, some ali'i, some Hawaiians understood that, got on board, and then sincerely used this new tool as in their lives. And I won't get into it now, but my dissertation talks about in the 1890s, Hawaiians using Christianity as the central tool to fight against annexation and to continue the independence of their nation. So Christianity became a tool for them in many ways that way. Sorry.
No, that was excellent. It fills in, you hear the story. Malia's laughing, having lived in Maui and whatnot. We hear all of this, and it's just, Malia, you want to comment on that? I see you're bursting at the seams there. So.
Well, I had heard much of this, but thank you so much for just tying it all together and to really explain the conflict and the turmoil that was happening in this time. And, this is, I think, part of what we don't understand often. And we talk about how quickly Hawaii converts to Christianity. But what you're also conveying is that it is so multifaceted. There are so many things that go into this process. And it wasn't an instant thing. Yes, having the influence of the ali'i is so important. And yet, like many of us who struggle in faith, we all those of us who choose faith also, you know, some people like to say, oh, it's like, you know, it's just like one day you're one thing and the next thing suddenly you're a Christian, and you just follow that path and you do it unceasingly. And yet we know that faith is often a struggle. And what you have just talked about is truly this conflict that many of us struggle with, and how we rectify it, or how we, you know, deal with it emotionally. So thank you so much. Just, I mean, so completely fascinating. And as I was listening to your conversation more about Nahiana, I'm also remembering that, so if she's born in she's born in 1818, and the couple system is, the I couple was broken in 1819. Her mother dies in 1823. That means she's 5 years old when Keōpūolani passes, correct?
Was it 1818? I thought it might have been 17. Let's check.
I was trying to take notes when you were talking. I thought that Keōpūolani was born in 1817 and she was born in 1818. Regardless of which, she's 6 years old when her mother dies, right?
She was born in 1815.
Oh, 1815. Okay, so she's a little bit older than that. All right. But, you know, she's still a very, very young person. And you're also talking about the fact that Keōpūolani gives her to Richards, Reverend Richards, as her kahu now. And I would assume that she's now living in his household. And, you know, so it is a time of great turmoil. Can you also mention whether or not, did Liholiho ever convert to Christianity?
He wasn't baptized. And it's one of those gray areas. So, but the interesting thing about Liholiho was that, now, if Keōpūolani would have lived a few years longer, you probably would have seen much more of an influence on Liholiho and Nahiana. But the fact that she died so soon after the mission arrived meant that they had a little bit of leeway, right? Because you're going to do what mom says, but if mom's not here. So they had a little bit of leeway to kind of make their own decisions and be influenced by others. Liholiho, there's a religious and a political part of this. Liholiho, to be honest, was in ways turned off by the haughtiness that he saw in the American mission. And so he remembered his father's relationship with the British, right? We know that Kamehameha I had actually sought help and even a protectorship from King George of England. And so we know that there had been this relationship between Kamehameha and the British. And so, and by the 1820s, there were several British folks who were living in Lahaina and other places. And so Liholiho says, okay, maybe Christianity, but maybe not these folks. And he's not saying, he's not against them. He's just keeping his options open. And so that's one of the main reasons he decides to go to London in 1824 and visit the King of England, is to explore, well, okay, so again, religion is a difficult word to use for this, mana, there's power in this faith of these new people. But there's 7 different, people that use it. So what about those folks? So Liholiho travels to London looking at exploring ideas of Christianity, the Anglican Church, that might fit better with what Hawaiians are looking at. I'm not talking about from a religion point of view. I'm talking about from a political point of view. Certainly would have, because the Anglican Church was about monarchy, right? It was all about the Church of England and so forth. So there's that exploration by Liholiho. So I don't know what level, how much he accepted or didn't accept the Christian mission. We do know that he was annoyed by some of their what he saw as ho'okano-ness, this haughtiness. Not haughtiness, that's not the right word. Their readiness to step up and take these positions. So he thought, maybe I'll look around, and then he dies.
Okay. Anyway, Ron, I just want to let you know that Keone had also written Mahalo Nui, such a heavy mo'olelo, which is exactly what it was. I mean, as Malia was saying, you could just see and it's, like she says, very similar to what we are today, Christian and Hawaiian, we are both. By the way, Keone also wanted everyone who is listening to know that the Nahiana's pa'u is on display at the museum. And, as soon as it opens up again, it'll take on a whole new meaning as I go at that poʻu. Thank you very much, Keone. Now, I did have one other question from Kahololaua, or no, Lalua. How did the role of Io, the supreme being of pre-Pa'ao religion, influence Keōpūolani's conversion? I mean, we don't want to put you on the spot, but I mean, if you feel comfortable answering, yes.
No, it's my job. In my mana'o, as a historian, again, I'm not Christian. I'm Buddhist. And I want to, before I get to that question, I want to go back to the other question real quick and say, as a Buddhist, I see religion in my life personally as a guide, as a path, as a guide, as something to shape my life. And I think even like, I remember being raised Catholic, and I'm not saying we weren't good Catholics, but my mom felt that she was a strict Catholic. And yet there were things that the Pope said that she didn't necessarily agree with, right? And there were rules of the Catholic Church that she didn't, well, look today. I mean, and so I'm not recommending that anyone be not 100% of their faith. I'm saying that's a way of understanding the fact that we can accept a path without necessarily believing in these certain things, right? Now jump forward to Io. And I'll just be blunt and I'll be concise, is that as a historian, and I don't claim to be someone who understands Hawaiian culture of the past, who knows all Hawaiian understandings of the past, but I will say from my reading, from my research, from my understanding, I don't know that Io was an existent philosophy that there was this. I know there's a very popular mana'o that Hawaiians were of one God before they were polytheistic, and as a historian, I would say that's not my mana'o that I understand. That doesn't mean it's not true. It means that of all the evidence I've ever crafted, of all the things that I've ever seen, I haven't found evidence of it. And if I have to write about, if I have to talk about the evolution of Hawaiian religion to today, I use the Kamakaus and the other folks who wrote about it long before I was here and others were here. And I say that, 5,000 years ago, no, I'm sorry, 2,000 years ago, there's a great book called God versus the Gods. And it talks about polytheism and monotheism. And it's not about evidence. It's not about what's right and wrong. It's a history. And it shows us that the vast majority of the world was polytheistic. When we're taught to be, I came up monotheistic and I came up as an American and so forth, and I just thought it was the weirdest thing in the world to believe that there was lots of gods. But it was the majority opinion 2,000 years ago. The Greeks, the Europeans, the people in Asia, most religions thought of many, 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 many gods. This idea of Christianity started with, I'm going to forget my Christian history right now, but Constantine and his brother and so forth, and this declaration of a Christian God and so forth. So again, not that one's right and one's wrong, but the world was polytheistic for thousands and thousands of years, and some folks became monotheistic. So Hawaiians, being part of that polytheistic tradition, it makes absolute sense that they move from polytheistic to this, to even today, some Polynesian Christians, I won't use his name, but I talked to a very good friend of mine years ago. When I asked the question, part of my question to my dissertation was how to, the question everybody has, how do Hawaiians be Christian and Hawaiian? And I came to answer that for myself in my dissertation, unquestionably. There's no question Hawaiians in the 1880s and 1890s were Christian and no less Hawaiian. They claimed both, they owned both. But my question to myself was always, how? And so when I asked my kumu, or a kumu friend of mine, who's a kahu and who's also a kumu hula, he explained to me that for him, Christianity was his religion and hula was his culture. And he didn't believe that he needed to not honor, if you want to call that, it's not worshiping, but to give space and to give thought and to give respect to his kupuna and his akua of the past. He could do that and still keep and still be a good Christian. So that was his understanding of it. So for me, And this is, I'm gonna get in trouble here, but again, I'm not saying there's a right and wrong. I'm saying my understanding is that need to attach ourselves, or not ourselves, but that need to attach to a single God prior to the missionaries, creates that pull for ʻio. Yeah, that's my answer.
I'll get you off the hook, Ron. Okay. Thank you. And it's a question that's very relevant. That it's still on everybody's mind today. I mean,
Right.
And so I won't go into that. But one thing, I'm gonna wrap it up. I see that there aren't really that many more questions, but I do want to ask you about. I know you're writing a book. If you can tell us a little bit more about that. And also in your presentations, you mentioned that curriculum. And I want you to review for everyone again where we can find that curriculum.
Sure, thank you for that. So my dissertation that became a manuscript that I'm turning in hopefully anytime now, that will hopefully be a book, is on that question of. So I had the question in my graduate studies. So how did Hawaiian Christians? Now I came at this question fully accepting the idea that Christianity was this awful colonial product that was imposed on Hawaiians and so forth. And I was going to write this dissertation to show how awful the missionaries were. But I had a nagging question, and that was, how did Hawaiians that were staunch Christians in the 1870s and 1890s, how they react to things like the Bayonet Constitution that we have blatant evidence the sons and daughters of the missionaries were part of, and how they react to the overthrow. So how did Hawaiian Christians, in the midst of their faith, react to the fact that their teachers had overthrown their queen? Did they just kind of put it aside, accept it, or what? I wanted to answer that question. And so I dove into my training was in the Hawaiian language sources, so I dove into the newspapers, spent 12 years looking through manuscripts, and also a very, very important manuscript. The history of the church. So you got me started. So that in 1863, when Boston pulls out of the church, pulls out of the mission. Now understand what a mission is. It's a going and preaching the gospel. So in 1863, when they declare success and pull out, they form a new organization that every librarian, every archivist that I've ever met calls the Hawaiian Evangelical Association. That's how we all know it. It's not that. Their constitution, which is at Bishop Museum, their constitution, written Makololo Hawaii, says the name of our organization is, and it's registered under Hawaiian Kingdom law, it's the Ahuhui Wanaleo o Hawaii. And why that's important is because you have to understand the context of the time. They're writing in Hawaiian. Every baptism, every preacher, everything's being done in Hawaiian. And their constitution, which is in Hawaiian, says the official language of the association is Hawaiian. They create two versions of their annual meetings of everything that's going on in the churches. A Hawaiian language version, and they say this in the bylaws, a Hawaiian language version and an English language version for our bosses in Boston. So every single history of the mission that's been written and published up until today relies on those English language HEA annual reports. They're significantly different in content and context than the Hawaiian language versions that I've read. They left stuff out. They told a rosier story. They did all kinds of things that aren't in the Hawaiian language, the official versions of that association. Dr. Puake and Ogemeyer and others, loaned me some of those. I got other ones at the different archives, and I started to read these stories that were incredible, and those were the reaction of the churches. In 1893, when the overthrow happens, 2 days later at Kaumakapili Church in Honolulu, the deacons of the church go down and they start ringing the bells at Kaumakapili to call everyone into church to hold prayer fast meetings, praying for the restoration of the queen and the continued independence of the nation. Now think about that. Their bosses, the Hawaiian board, Papa Hawaii was the officers of the AEH. Now they were mostly white, and it was white controlled. Those folks were integral, and I've got it all tagged out in my dissertation. Those folks were integral to the overthrow. They were part of the overthrow. They promoted the provisional government, and they sought annexation. They are the sons and grandsons of the mission who had turned the mission into an economic, political, and racial question. And so they overthrow the mission. The churches are on the opposite side, and that's a big deal for them. So Kamakapili, I wondered why 4:30, and I realized that martial law had been imposed, and you couldn't be on the streets from 10 p.m. to 4:30 a.m. So the minute they could, Hawaiian Christians went to their churches and prayed for the restoration of their queen in direct contestation of their officers of the Hawaiian Board. Waine'e Church, Keōpūolani's church, the day after the overthrow, the first instance. On January 18th, their deacons came together and did the same thing. And this blossomed. There were pastors among those, were native pastors among the AEH churches who sided with the provisional government. Very complex reasons. Some were because they wanted to keep their job and feed their families. Some were staunchly pro-annexation and pro-American, like Reverend Pali in Lahaina. Reverend Adam Pali, who had been pastor of the church in Lahaina for 20 years, was staunchly pro-annexation. He became the president of the Annexation Club of Maui. So how did those native Christians react? Those ones that I had thought had been brainwashed. They called a meeting of all the people of the Lahaina church. Now remember that the churches by this time had incorporated under Hawaiian Kingdom law. So that incorporation papers spell out how you get rid of ministers, how you get rid of trustees, and so forth. And they called for a majority vote of the members of the church. So the members come together, they pass a resolution ousting Pali from the church and kicking him out of the halepule, the kahu's residence, and 68 of 73 members sign it. He's gone. So Pali writes a letter that I found in the Judd archives in Bishop Museum, which were under kapu until 2006. I found a letter there that talked about, that was in Hawaiian, Pali writing to Judd. Albert Francis Judd was head of the Hawaiian Board, and he was also Supreme Court Justice for the provisional government. Judd sends 2 pro-annexation pastors to Lahaina. They call a meeting of the Maui Presbytery, and they excommunicate every member who signed the petition against Pali, and they reinstate Pali as pastor, which they can't do. The laws of the church show that. And you talk about the churches anyway, they were congregationalist churches. They were supposed to be of the people, not of the central organized power. But those sons and daughters of the mission, those sons of the mission had become so corrupted that they now struggled to hold on to power. And in 17 different churches around the islands, my book documents the same thing happening, of pastors coming out pro-annexation and the congregations saying, not in our church, and kicking them out. So the really fascinating thing to think about in this narrative is the fact that where I was wondering, well, did they go Christian or did they go Hawaiian? They said, we're claiming both. We're Hawaiian and we're Christian, and that makes us no less Hawaiian, and we claim our churches and we claim God. And for them, it wasn't a racial question. They were kicking out native Hawaiian pastors who were pro-annexation. For the mission, it was racial. One of the main reasons was because they wrote prolifically about Hawaiians didn't have the capacity to run the government. For Hawaiians, it was about God and nation. So my book documents intricately the involvement of the sons of the mission in those political events, and it documents, in their own words, Hawaiians fighting back, claiming God, and claiming their churches. Long answer. Oh, and the curriculum. So it's on Wailola's website today. But if you go to so I have an academia.edu account. And everything I've ever published is up there. So the curriculum is there. If it's at academia.edu, you search for Ronald Williams Jr., or you can just Google. I believe you can Google Ronald Williams Jr. and that academia site will come up. But if you look for academia.edu, Ronald Williams Jr., that curriculum is there along with anything else you might be interested in. Oh, sorry, I can't hear you. Can't hear you. I can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Yes, sorry, my fingers were too fast there. My apologies to everyone. But what we'll do for everyone that's still listening is, I think we'll somehow get it on the rebroadcast. We'll put that in, And what we will also do is somehow get it onto our website. We'll talk to the webmasters and whatnot. So if you want to view this again, it will be on YouTube or as part of our archives in our YouTube, and I think I will also get it put up onto our website. In the meantime, Ron, just so you know, the comments that we're getting from everyone is like, wow, and it's like, I can't wait for your book. Yay. And so we'll end on that high note. Yes. Again, very interesting. People are still writing comments on that, and it's true. It is. I am Hawaiian and I am Christian. So we're at the time of our the end of our session.
Mahalo to you all for inviting me.
By the way, I just want you to know, Kimmy Kester from Boston has been listening in. Thank you, Kimmy. So just so you know, you had a national audience here, Ron. And you also had Kauai was represented in the house, and so great understanding, great everything. As I said, we'll all of us, I think, can hardly wait for your book. I want to invite everyone to join us again in October. It will be October 18th for our next one. Every third Sunday of the month, we will be having a new series. But Dr. Ron Williams, everyone, I think if you're listening, maybe we can all clap our hands or, give you a virtual aloha. Thank you, everyone. We're going to be signing off at this time. And again, we have our documentary that's on our TV. And thank you again. I hope you've all enjoyed the series and share it with your friends. Mahalo and aloha. Have a great rest of the month, everyone. Stay healthy and be safe. Mahalo.